The tank everyone loves to roast might be the one that actually won the war. Flames lick across the metal skin of a Sherman as its crew scrambles out, smoke rolling against a gray sky. Cut to the roar of factories, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, assembly lines hammering out steel at a rhythm that sounds like war drums. Then to Normandy's hedgerows, desert sands, shattered Italian towns, jungles in the Pacific, and finally the dusty plains of the Middle East in 1967, where the same familiar silhouette, the Sherman, still rolls forward. The world remembers the Tiger, the Panther, the monsters of German design, but the humble, often mocked Sherman was the tank that actually helped win a world war. This story isn't about duels, it's about winning a global war. The Sherman's reputation on the internet is a meme, the Ronson, the Tommy Cooker, the rolling coffin. The jokes write themselves: burning tanks, outgunned crews, waves of cheap steel overwhelming superior enemies. But those myths miss the truth. The truth is that the M4 Sherman wasn't designed to win duels in open fields. It was designed to win campaigns, to cross oceans, roll off ships, fight anywhere from Tunisia to Tokyo, and be fixed, fueled, and fighting again by morning. The real measure of a tank isn't how it performs in a single duel. It's how it performs across thousands of miles through months of mud against a determined enemy when every day means the difference between victory and defeat. Let's start with the myths. First, the Ronson, supposedly lighting up every time. The early Shermans did have a serious problem. Ammo stored high in the hull, surrounded by fuel tanks. A penetrating hit in the right place could ignite the ammunition and turn the tank into a fireball. Crews called it brewing up. But in 1944, engineers solved this. They introduced wet stowage, ammunition submerged in fluid-filled racks that drastically reduced fires. Statistically, tanks with wet stowage were far less likely to burn after being hit. The myth persisted, but the data doesn't lie. Later, Shermans were among the safest tanks in the war to crew. Second, outgunned by everything German. In 1942 and early 1943, when the Sherman entered combat, its 75mm gun could defeat Panzer III's and earlier V's comfortably. Its high explosive shells tore through enemy infantry positions and bunkers, something German tank guns often struggled with. As the war evolved and heavier German armor appeared, the Panther, the Tiger, the Allies adapted. The 76mm gun arrived, capable of penetrating most German tanks with new ammunition types like HVAP. The British, always inventive, went further, cramming their powerful 17-pounder gun into the Sherman turret, birthing the Firefly. That tank could kill a Tiger at over 1,000 meters, something even German crews feared. The internet may say the Sherman was obsolete, but the Germans certainly didn't treat it that way. Third, the gasoline engine. Critics claim it was a death trap, but reality is more nuanced. Many tanks, German and Allied alike, used gasoline. Fires weren't primarily caused by fuel type, but by ammunition placement and penetration angles. In tests, diesel Shermans didn't burn significantly less often than gasoline ones. The death trap myth is one of perception, not fact. And then, the final myth, that the Allies simply zerg-rushed their way to victory, throwing endless Shermans at German panzers until one finally won. But war isn't a video game. It's logistics, coordination, and uptime. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a system. It worked with artillery, infantry, engineers, and aircraft. It had radios in every hull, standardized parts across thousands of units, and could be repaired in hours with field kits. A Tiger that couldn't start its engine was just a bunker. A Sherman that could be repaired and redeployed by nightfall was a weapon that kept fighting. The secret of the Sherman's success wasn't in armor thickness or gun caliber. It was in design philosophy. American engineers knew they were fighting a global war. That meant ships, rail cars, bridges, ports, and maintenance depots. A tank that couldn't cross a bridge, that couldn't fit on a landing craft, that couldn't be mass-produced or repaired in the field, wasn't worth its steel. So the Sherman was built to fit everywhere, go anywhere, and be maintained by soldiers, not scientists. It could roll off an LST onto a beach, climb a ridge, or cross a river with minimal prep. It wasn't glamorous. It was effective. It was also, crucially, built for the crew. Inside, the Sherman had space, room to breathe, to move, to escape. A 3-man turret let the commander command instead of loading shells himself. That alone meant faster decisions and better situational awareness. The driver and co-driver had escape hatches, something many German tanks lacked. Vision blocks gave the crew a better sense of their surroundings. Ergonomics mattered, because a crew that could see, talk, and react quickly could win fights that looked hopeless on paper. Even more impressive was the stabilizer. The Sherman had an early gyroscopic stabilizer for its main gun, a first for many tank crews. It wasn't perfect, and many units didn't use it properly at first. But when trained, it meant a Sherman could fire more accurately on the move, a massive advantage in mobile warfare. Later models refined the system, making it even more valuable. And then there were the radios. It's hard to overstate how important this was. Every Sherman had one. Many German tanks didn't, especially early in the war. Radios meant coordination between platoons, with infantry, with artillery, even with aircraft. A Sherman platoon could call in a P-47 strike or an artillery barrage within minutes. That's not a duel. That's combined arms. That's how wars are won. Meanwhile, the Germans were building masterpieces, Panthers, Tigers, tanks that were magnificent in engineering but disastrous in reliability. A Tiger could dominate a battlefield if it could reach it. Its transmission was fragile, its engine overstrained, its logistics nightmarish. Many were abandoned because they broke down before seeing battle. A Sherman might not match a Tiger's gun, but it would arrive. And in war, arrival counts. By 1944, nearly 50,000 Shermans had been produced. Factories turned them out faster than the Germans could destroy them. But this wasn't just quantity, it was quality in production. Parts were interchangeable across models. A broken suspension from one could fit another. Mechanics could cannibalize wrecks and have a tank running by dawn. That kind of uptime was unheard of in German formations, where even a thrown track could immobilize a tank for days. Every Sherman was a piece of a much larger machine, the American logistics miracle. Spare parts flowed from factories to ports to depots across Europe and the Pacific. Trains, trucks, and ships carried not just tanks, but the ability to keep tanks fighting. The U.S. Army could maintain 80 to 90% operational readiness in armored units, a staggering figure compared to the German average, often below 50%. When you multiply that by months of fighting, the math becomes clear. The Sherman wasn't outnumbering the enemy by luck. It was outlasting them. The Sherman was never meant to be the heaviest tank on the field. It was meant to be the most present. It was the tank that arrived, fought, and kept moving when others stalled. Its secret weapon wasn't a massive gun or thick armor. It was consistency. Reliability is invisible until you don't have it, and in war, that invisibility wins battles. A tank that breaks down on the way to combat might as well not exist. The Sherman, with its simple mechanical systems and standardized components, rarely failed in the field. Its radial engines, many borrowed from aircraft designs, were robust, easy to replace, and forgiving of rough maintenance. The Germans, by contrast, built tanks that were mechanical divas. Beautiful to behold, deadly when they worked, but constantly demanding attention. Panthers often broke final drives just maneuvering. Tigers snapped gearboxes in soft ground. The Sherman could cross a marsh, grind through snow, and climb rubble without shedding parts like confetti. That reliability extended to logistics. The Sherman was designed from the ground up to be moved. Its size was a conscious choice. It could fit onto standard rail cars, cross common bridges, and roll onto landing ships without modification. Tigers required special rail wagons, bridge reinforcements, and elaborate loading procedures. Strategic mobility isn't glamorous, but it wins campaigns. A tank that can go from a Michigan factory to a French hedgerow in a matter of weeks is worth more than a dozen that can't. Leave Germany. Sherman variants multiplied with purpose, not vanity. Every battlefield problem invited a new adaptation. When roads turned to mud and snow bogged down advances, wider tracks and improved suspensions appeared. The M4A3E8, Easy 8. It rode smoother, gripped better, and carried a 76mm gun with access to HVAP ammunition capable of killing Panthers at combat ranges. When breakthroughs needed a shield, the M4A3C2 Jumbo appeared, its armor thickened to absurd levels. It led assaults, absorbed fire, and survived hits that would vaporize lighter tanks. Crews loved it because it meant living to fight again. The British, masters of improvisation, turned the Sherman into the Firefly, a tank whose 17-pounder gun could punch through the front plate of a Tiger from over a kilometer away. German crews quickly learned to fear the long-barreled Sherman lurking behind hedgerows, its flash announcing the death of even their best machines. Fireflies were mixed among standard Sherman troops so that every unit had at least one tank capable of countering heavy armor. The Allies didn't chase parity through raw numbers. They chased function. But the Sherman wasn't only about guns and armor. Its chassis became the foundation for an entire ecosystem of battlefield tools. Amphibious DD versions with collapsible skirts floated ashore on D-Day. Mine flail variants, nicknamed crabs, cleared paths through minefields for following troops. Dozer-equipped Shermans bulldozed obstacles and built cover. Recovery variants hauled wrecks from the front lines to be repaired and returned to combat. Each of these adaptations solved a problem the Germans were still improvising around. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was an army's toolbox. And it could move. For all the talk of tigers thundering across the steppe, the Sherman's mobility was the one that mattered. It wasn't the fastest tank, but it could actually reach where it needed to go. It didn't bog down under its own weight or collapse bridges under its treads. When weather turned the ground to mush, the Sherman's moderate weight and optional duckbill track extenders kept it rolling. While Panthers spun their tracks and buried themselves, Shermans kept pace with the infantry and seized ground. The true mobility of a tank isn't how fast it can go, it's whether it can go anywhere. Firepower, armor, and mobility, the eternal triangle of tank design, were always contextual. The Sherman didn't dominate any single category, but it balanced all three better than almost anything else in its time. Its 75mm gun was a high-explosive specialist, perfect for infantry support, demolishing buildings, and cutting through soft targets. When heavier armor appeared, the 76mm gun and British 17-pounder filled the gap. It wasn't always about killing tanks, it was about enabling combined arms. The Sherman could lay smoke, blast anti-tank guns, suppress machine nests, and call in artillery. That made it a team player on a battlefield full of soloists. That teamwork was what defined Allied warfare. The Sherman wasn't meant to duel Panthers, it was meant to work with infantry, artillery, and air support to destroy them. This was the doctrine of combined arms, every element covering the weaknesses of the other. A Sherman platoon advancing under a smokescreen calling in artillery to pound a tree line, while P-47 Thunderbolts circle above waiting for target calls. That's how the Allies fought. The tank was the node in a deadly synchronized network, and this doctrine wasn't theoretical. It worked again and again. At Aricourt in September 1944, American armored divisions found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by German panzer brigades equipped with Panthers. On paper, it should have been a massacre. Instead, the fog rolled in. The Americans used their radios to coordinate artillery and ambush positions, and the result was astonishing. The Shermans destroyed or disabled more than 100 German tanks for minimal losses. They didn't win because their tanks were better. They won because their system was. Radios, coordination, logistics, and discipline turned a supposedly inferior machine into a war-winning tool. Meanwhile, in Normandy's bocage, the Sherman adapted again. Dense hedgerows turned the countryside into a nightmare maze where tanks could be ambushed from 10 meters away. American engineers welded makeshift Cullen devices, steel prongs, onto the fronts of their Shermans, turning them into living plows that could burst through hedges and surprise enemy positions. Fireflies took up overwatch, their long 17-pounder barrels poking through foliage to pick off any German cat foolish enough to show its nose. The Sherman wasn't a static design. It was learning faster than the enemy could respond. Even in Italy's steep hills and narrow towns, the Sherman proved its adaptability. Its moderate width allowed it to maneuver through streets where heavier tanks couldn't go. Its 75mm gun, though derided online, was perfect for knocking out fortifications and strongpoints. Its dozer variants cleared rubble to keep supply routes open. This was the pattern again and again. While the Germans built weapons that dominated the ideal battlefield, the Allies built weapons that dominated real ones. In the Pacific, the Sherman's story was different but equally defining. Against Japanese armor, its gun was overkill. Against bunkers and fortified caves, it was indispensable. Flamethrower conversions of the Sherman, nicknamed Zippos, became the terror of the islands. A burst of liquid fire could clear an entire position that infantry alone might have taken hours or dozens of lives to capture. In these jungles, the Sherman wasn't fighting tanks. It was fighting terrain, concrete, and fanaticism. And it won. The Sherman's versatility even extended beyond the war itself. In the years after, 1945, its story didn't end. It evolved. Israel, facing existential threats and an arms embargo, took old M4 chassis and turned them into Super Shermans. the M50 and M51. They mounted new engines, modern suspensions, and high-velocity guns capable of fighting contemporary tanks. In 1956 and 1967, these upgraded Shermans were still winning battles. A design born in 1941 was still relevant a quarter-century later. That's not obsolescence, that's genius. The myth says the Sherman was mediocre. The truth says it was timeless. If the Sherman had one true superpower, it wasn't its gun, armor, or speed. It was availability, the ability to show up in overwhelming, reliable numbers wherever the fight demanded. That's not a romantic idea. It's a logistical one. War is fought by production lines, not just soldiers, and the Sherman embodied that fact better than any tank in history. By 1944, the Sherman was being produced in multiple factories across the United States, and each assembly line spoke the same mechanical language. Bolts, turrets, guns, transmissions, all interchangeable. This meant that a Sherman built in Detroit could be repaired with parts from California or Pennsylvania without a second thought. In the field, maintenance crews became magicians. They would cannibalize a wreck, pull its transmission, weld it into another hull, patch the armor with spare tracks, and send it back into battle within hours. Every destroyed Sherman became a donor for the next one. The Germans had no such luxury. Each of their tanks was a bespoke creation, finely tuned and impossible to mass repair. The Americans called it uptime. At any given moment, 80 to 90% of Sherman tanks were operational in the field. The German numbers, especially by late 1944, often hovered below 50%. Tigers broke their tracks or final drives constantly. Panthers needed specialized crews and parts that were always in short supply. Even if a Panther outgunned a Sherman, there were often 2 or 3 Shermans in working order for every one Panther that actually reached combat. War doesn't reward the perfect weapon. It rewards the weapon that's ready. This wasn't just luck. It was deliberate design. The Sherman was engineered to be maintainable. Hatches were large, access points obvious, and components modular. Crews could swap engines or transmissions in a matter of hours. Field manuals were clear, tools standardized, and spare parts shipped in bulk. German mechanics, by contrast, often needed factory assistants or machine shops to fix their tanks. A single broken gearbox could sideline a Panther for weeks. Even fuel mattered. The Sherman's engines, whether radial or Ford V8, could run on widely available gasoline. That might sound trivial, but it simplified the Allied fuel network dramatically. The Germans, juggling diesel and gasoline engines across different tank models, struggled to keep them supplied. By the end of the war, some tanks were literally abandoned because their fuel trucks couldn't reach them. The Sherman wasn't a technological marvel. It was a logistical masterpiece. Strategic mobility was another hidden edge. The Sherman's weight, roughly 30 tons, was no accident. That number was chosen carefully so that it could be transported across oceans and bridges without breaking them. A Tiger weighed nearly twice that, making it a logistical nightmare. Bridges in France and Belgium often couldn't handle the load. When a Tiger arrived at the front, it had usually destroyed a few roads or bridges just getting there. The Sherman could roll across standard military pontoon bridges and fit inside landing ships. It could go wherever the fight was. The Allied war machine was global, and the Sherman was built for that stage. Even its design simplicity helped it win. While the Germans used complex interleaved road wheels that clogged with mud and froze solid in winter, the Sherman used straightforward bogies that any mechanic could clean and replace. Its engine didn't require delicate tuning, and its suspension, especially in the later HVSS Easy 8 models, offered a smooth, stable ride that improved crew accuracy and comfort. In an army built on movement, that mattered. Soldiers who could rely on their machines fought better, longer, and with higher morale. All of these qualities, reliability, maintainability, transportability, fed into the Sherman's ultimate advantage: tempo. The Allies could keep the pressure on because their machines kept working. Every hour a Sherman was moving forward was an hour the enemy was retreating or repairing. German commanders constantly complained that their panzers couldn't keep up with their own offensives. Fuel shortages, broken tracks, and mechanical failures crippled them long before Allied firepower did. The Sherman, on the other hand, just kept showing up again and again until it won by exhaustion. And when the Sherman did fight, it fought smart. Crews learned how to exploit terrain, flanking opportunities, and coordination to their advantage. In head-on duels, sure, the German cats had thicker armor and longer guns, but few fights were clean duels. The battlefield was chaos: mud, trees, fog, and artillery. In those conditions, the Sherman's agility and communications often turned supposed weaknesses into strengths. It could reposition faster, call for air or artillery strikes, and attack from multiple directions. Panthers and Tigers with slower turrets and worse visibility often couldn't respond in time. Visibility is another underrated factor. The Sherman had excellent optics and large periscopes. Its turret cupola gave the commander a wide field of view, and the interior layout allowed for rapid communication among the crew. Compare that to the early German designs where the commander doubled as the gunner, splitting his attention between aiming and leading. The Sherman's three-man turret was a quiet revolution. It allowed the commander to actually command. He could scan, plan, and coordinate without being buried in controls. In combat, that difference was life or death. And the Sherman's crews weren't fools. They knew when to fight and when not to. Manuals and after-action reports show that U.S. and British tankers developed disciplined engagement tactics. They avoided charging Tigers head-on, using cover, smoke, and flanking maneuvers instead. They used their radios to coordinate multi-angle attacks, calling in artillery to distract heavy tanks while another Sherman moved to the side. It was a chess game, not a joust, and the Sherman was the faster piece. The myth of Zerg rushing misses all of this. Allied doctrine didn't throw tanks away. It maximized their survivability through teamwork and planning. A single Tiger might destroy several Shermans in a duel, but those Shermans had already fixed its position. Within minutes, artillery or aircraft would strike. The Tiger's armor could resist a shell. It couldn't resist being surrounded. That's the logic of modern war. Coordination beats isolation. Even psychologically, the Sherman played a role. Crews trusted it. They knew if they were hit, they had a good chance of surviving. They knew the tank would start when the engine turned over. They knew spare parts were waiting at the next depot. That confidence fed their aggression and persistence. A crew that believes in its machine fights harder, longer, and smarter. And those machines weren't just fighting for America. Through Lend-Lease, Shermans went everywhere, to Britain, Canada, Free France, and even the Soviet Union. Each nation customized them to its needs. The British built Fireflies and DD tanks. The Soviets stripped down models for ease of maintenance and used them alongside their T-34s. The French used them to liberate their own homeland. The same tank design, modified a dozen ways, became the backbone of Allied armor worldwide. That's not just versatility, it's standardization on a planetary scale. By the end of 1944, the Sherman wasn't a weapon of convenience. It was a weapon of inevitability. Its presence was a constant, its sound familiar from Africa to Asia. It wasn't the flashiest, but it was the one that always showed up. When the smoke cleared, when the war ended, it was the Sherman, mocked, maligned, underestimated, that stood as the symbol of Allied victory. The Sherman's true brilliance was that it was never locked into one identity. It evolved, it adapted, and it solved problems that no other tank in the war even attempted to address. You could take a Sherman from the sands of North Africa, ship it to Italy, modify it for amphibious landings in Normandy, and later see that same chassis rebuilt into a bulldozer clearing wreckage in Berlin. It was a tank that aged with the war, growing wiser with every campaign. The Americans and British understood something that the Germans often ignored. War is not static. It changes daily, sometimes hourly. The enemy changes tactics, the terrain changes character, and even the climate becomes a combatant. The Sherman was built to change with it. It had a modular design philosophy decades before that word became fashionable. Its hull and suspension could accept new turrets, guns, and armor with minimal redesign. When the Allies needed a flamethrower tank, engineers didn't need to invent one from scratch. They just converted a Sherman. When they needed bridge layers, they built them on Sherman frames. Recovery vehicles? Same chassis. Tank destroyers? The M10, M36, direct descendants of the same bloodline. That flexibility became an unspoken advantage. Every time a new threat appeared, the Sherman adapted faster than the Germans could design a countermeasure. In Normandy, when bocage hedgerows turned the terrain into a death trap, the Cullen device, the simple but genius hedgerow cutter, was welded onto hundreds of Shermans within weeks. That grassroots ingenuity was only possible because the tank's design invited modification. Crews and engineers didn't need permission from a factory. They could weld, bolt, and hammer their way to innovation right on the field. The Germans, meanwhile, were trapped by their own perfectionism. Their tanks were marvels of craftsmanship, but that also made them brittle. Every alteration required retooling, every repair demanded specialists. The Panther's production, for example, involved more than a dozen factories spread across bombed-out cities, and even minor design tweaks could delay shipments for weeks. The Sherman factories, by contrast, churned forward relentlessly. Standardization wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. Even the way the Sherman was used reflected that power. The Allies didn't see it as a duelist. They saw it as a cog in a much larger engine. Every Sherman platoon operated in concert with artillery, engineers, and infantry. Radio nets tied them together in a seamless network. This communication culture was so embedded that American commanders could redirect entire armored columns mid-battle. A Tiger crew might be better at aiming, but a Sherman commander could coordinate an army. The effect was cumulative. On battlefields like Aracourt and the Ardennes, Sherman units performed far above expectations precisely because of that networked efficiency. The Aracourt battle remains one of the greatest demonstrations of how tactical intelligence and coordination can defeat superior hardware. Fog blanketed the fields, blinding both sides. The Germans advanced confidently, believing they had the upper hand with Panthers. But the Americans, using their radios and maps, anticipated the attack, repositioned, and ambushed them repeatedly. The result? Dozens of German tanks destroyed, often before they even knew what hit them. The Panthers' advantage in armor and gun meant nothing if it never saw its target. At the same time, Sherman crews were learning, quickly. Training programs in the US and UK evolved throughout the war, incorporating hard-earned battlefield lessons. Early crews had often been thrown into combat with minimal experience, leading to high losses in North Africa. But by 1944, the Allied training machine was producing seasoned, technically skilled crews who knew how to exploit the Sherman's strengths and mitigate its weaknesses. They understood gunnery angles, knew how to use cover effectively, and made full use of the stabilizer and radio coordination. Experience turned what critics called a mediocre tank into a lethal instrument. The human element can't be overstated. The Sherman gave its crews a fighting chance to live, and that mattered. Unlike many tanks, the Sherman's interior layout and escape hatches meant that when disaster struck, men could get out. War diaries are filled with stories of Shermans taking hits, catching fire, and still having 3 or 4 of the 5 crew members crawl away alive. A destroyed tank could be replaced. A trained crew could return to fight again. In an attritional war, saving people was saving combat power. That survivability only improved as the war went on. Wet stowage dramatically cut ammunition fires. Additional armor plates, sandbags, spare track links, and concrete layers were field-applied to key areas. Some of these were crude solutions, but they worked. Later models like the Jumbo took that idea further, with thick cast fronts that could deflect shots from even 88mm guns. It was the opposite of the German approach, where design perfection came first and adaptation came later. The Allies didn't wait for a factory solution. They made do, and they made it work. This adaptability created a psychological shift on the battlefield. German tankers, once confident that any Allied tank was an easy kill, began to realize that wasn't true anymore. Fireflies and 76mm Shermans were punching back. Allied tank formations moved faster and hit harder than before. The days of German armor casually dominating the field were fading fast. The myth of invincible tigers was being rewritten in real time by Sherman crews who had learned how to fight smarter. And yet, even when the Sherman couldn't win a head-on duel, it could win the campaign. The reason was tempo, the speed of operations. When German armor was bogged down by maintenance and fuel shortages, the Sherman units were already across the next river. The Allies could rotate exhausted units out, repair their tanks, and bring them back within days. German units often waited weeks for spare parts or replacements. That constant operational readiness wore down the Axis machine until it collapsed under its own weight. By the late stages of the war, the Sherman had become a symbol of inevitability. It wasn't the hero of a duel. It was the backbone of a machine that never stopped moving forward. Every bridge crossed, every village cleared, every road opened owed something to the Sherman. When people look at photos of Allied armies surging through Europe in 1945, the silhouette they see most often isn't the Tiger. It's the Sherman, dusty, battered, but still rolling. In a sense, the Sherman wasn't designed to win glory. It was designed to win wars. And it did. Its victories weren't cinematic. They were statistical, logistical, and operational. It outlived, outnumbered, and outlasted its enemies. For every Tiger or Panther that broke down, there were a dozen Shermans advancing another mile. The German tanks were predators. The Sherman was evolution itself, endlessly reproducing, adapting, and surviving. This adaptability carried into the post-war years, proving that the design had been decades ahead of its time. Nations around the world continued to use the Sherman well into the 1960s and beyond. From Latin America to the Middle East, its reliability and upgrade potential kept it relevant long after the last Tiger had rusted away in a museum. Israel's Super Shermans fought against T-54s and Centurions and still held their own, proof that good engineering and smart logistics never go out of style. The Sherman had become more than a tank. It was a philosophy made of steel. Build what works, fix it fast, and keep it moving. Every aspect of the Sherman's creation was driven by one fundamental question: how do you fight a world war, not just a battle? That meant designing a tank that could be built by the thousands, maintained in jungles, deserts, and frozen forests, and operated by crews who might have been farmers or mechanics 6 months earlier. The Sherman had to be understood as much as it had to be effective. American industry was uniquely suited to that task. In 1942, factories that had once produced cars and farm equipment were retooled to build tanks. The assembly line logic of Detroit and Cleveland became the beating heart of the U.S. armored force. Unlike the German system, where craftsmanship ruled and every tank was a small masterpiece, the American method prized repeatability. Each Sherman that rolled off the line was nearly identical to the next, meaning training, maintenance, and spare parts all worked seamlessly. To the engineers, perfection wasn't the goal. Consistency was. They understood that a war of attrition would be won not by who had the thickest armor, but by who could replace losses faster. So the Sherman's construction balanced strength and manufacturability. It used rolled armor where possible. Cast components were efficient and modular fittings throughout. You didn't need to rebuild the entire tank to fix it. You just replaced the damaged part. The logistical system that followed was staggering. The U.S. military shipped tanks across 2 oceans simultaneously, often dismantled and packed into crates to save space. They could be reassembled near the front within days. That kind of mobility was unprecedented in military history. No other armored force on Earth had such flexibility. The Sherman wasn't just a weapon, it was the manifestation of an industrial miracle. And with that miracle came versatility. The Sherman became the foundation for an entire generation of specialized vehicles that turned the tide in every theater. Amphibious landings would have been far bloodier without the DD Shermans, which floated to shore under their curious canvas skirts. Engineers modified standard M4s with explosive line charges to clear obstacles, mine flails to detonate hidden traps, and bulldozer blades to carve through debris. These weren't one-off prototypes. They were mass-produced solutions to real combat problems. Every time an obstacle appeared, there was a Sherman variant ready to meet it. Even the way the Allies thought about combat changed because of the Sherman. It forced them to think holistically, how to coordinate tanks, infantry, and air power as a single organism. The days of isolated tank duels were over. By 1944, a Sherman formation wasn't moving alone. It advanced with artillery on call, fighter bombers overhead, and infantry riding on the hulls. Radios tied everyone together, creating an early version of what modern armies now call networked warfare. This system was devastatingly effective. When a Panther or Tiger revealed itself, it wasn't just facing a single Sherman, it was facing a synchronized strike from multiple directions and multiple units. A Sherman might spot the target, radio its position, lay smoke, and then let artillery or air support do the killing. The Panther might win the duel, but the Sherman team won the engagement. The Germans never developed an equivalent system. Their tanks fought brilliantly as individuals but poorly as teams, and while German tanks grew heavier and more complex, the Sherman evolved intelligently. The EZ-8, or M4A3E8, became one of the finest tanks of the late war. Its new HVSS suspension smoothed out the ride, allowing for faster travel and better gunnery accuracy. The 76mm gun gave it the punch needed to fight Panthers, especially when firing high-velocity HVAP rounds. It wasn't just a stopgap, it was a genuine evolution. Crews loved it for its comfort, handling, and reliability. It was the perfect distillation of the Sherman philosophy. Take what works, make it better, and get it into the field fast. Then there was the Jumbo, a tank that looked like a Sherman wearing armor plates for winter. It was heavy, slow, and built like a battering ram. Jumbos led assaults, soaking up punishment that would have annihilated lighter tanks. Their thickened armor, up to 150 mm at the front, could shrug off the dreaded 88mm guns at combat ranges. In the Battle of the Bulge, these tanks became legends. When American lines buckled under the surprise German offensive, it was the jumbos that anchored defensive positions, taking hits and returning fire long after other vehicles had fallen silent. The British Firefly, meanwhile, became the stuff of myth. Its long 17-pounder gun looked almost absurd on the Sherman chassis, like a lance on a lightweight horse. But that gun was lethal. At Villers-Bocage, at Normandy, and across Europe, Fireflies ambushed German heavy tanks from hidden positions, their powerful AP shells slicing through armor that most Allied guns couldn't scratch. German commanders learned to target Fireflies first, recognizing the elongated barrel as a mortal threat. Crews sometimes camouflaged the barrels with paint or netting just to survive a little longer. In the combined Allied force, the Firefly was the sniper. Quiet, deadly, irreplaceable. Together, the EZ-8, the Jumbo, and the Firefly showed the Sherman's design flexibility in full bloom. Three completely different roles, maneuver, assault, and precision, built on one shared foundation. No German tank line could do that. Panthers and Tigers had no amphibious versions, no engineering variants, no flame or recovery conversions. They were magnificent predators, but one-dimensional. The Sherman was a species with dozens of successful adaptations. The difference between those two philosophies, specialization versus adaptability, foreshadowed the way modern militaries think. The Tiger was built for dominance. The Sherman was built for endurance. In the long run, endurance always wins. It's easy in hindsight to romanticize the big cats of the German army. Their kill counts were high, their lines sleek, their cannons thunderous. But those numbers tell an incomplete story. The Tiger's kill ratio meant little when most of its victories came in small, isolated encounters. It didn't decide campaigns. It decorated them. The Sherman, on the other hand, decided the war. It didn't win by fear. It won by function. Every tank it killed mattered, but every mile it drove mattered more. Every bridge it crossed, every town it helped secure, every infantry squad it supported. Those were the quiet victories that added up to global triumph. When historians call the Sherman the workhorse of the Allied war machine, they mean it literally. It carried the burden of an entire front every single day without collapsing under its own weight. Even the soldiers who mocked it in 1942 were defending it fiercely by 1945. Letters from tank crews and after-action reports are full of affection and respect. They complained about its flaws, what soldier doesn't, but they also knew what they had. The Sherman got them home alive more often than not. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And perhaps that's the truest measure of a tank's success, not how it looks on paper, not how many kills it scores, but how many soldiers believe in it. By the middle of 1944, the Sherman had become more than a tank. It was a strategic symbol of how the Allies fought their war. It represented mobility, standardization, and industrial power. It rolled off landing. Ships at Normandy thundered through hedgerows and pressed eastward into the heart of Europe with a rhythm that no Axis tank could match. When Eisenhower called the Jeep the C-47 and the Sherman the three tools that won the war, it wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was fact. These machines turned strategy into momentum. The brilliance of the Sherman wasn't in flashy engineering. It was in restraint. American designers knew they could build something heavier. They tested prototypes with thicker armor, even experimented with 90mm guns. But every pound added meant fewer tanks on ships, slower bridges, and harder logistics. Instead of chasing super tanks, they pursued balance. That discipline, the decision not to over-design, was what made the Sherman such a weapon of continuity. It was a tank that could be everywhere, not just somewhere impressive. When the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944, the Sherman's adaptability was put to its ultimate test. The beaches were chaos, artillery, mines, underwater obstacles, and fierce resistance. But among the first to land were the duplex-drive Shermans. Wrapped in their strange flotation skirts, they slid into the surf from landing craft and churned forward toward the sand under their own power. Some sank, swamped by rough seas, but enough made it ashore to provide crucial fire support for the infantry. Those ungainly half-boat, half-tank hybrids proved that versatility wasn't just clever, it was life-saving. Once inland, the Shermans faced their most difficult environment yet, the bocage. Normandy's hedgerows weren't just vegetation. They were walls of earth and roots, 4 feet thick and taller than a man. They turned every field into a fortress, and every lane into an ambush. German troops with Panzerfausts and concealed guns shredded early Allied advances. For a moment, it seemed the Sherman's momentum had met its match. But then came another flash of innovation. Sergeant Curtis Cullen's hedge cutter welded together from scrap steel taken from destroyed German obstacles. This simple pronged device allowed tanks to burst through hedgerows like battering rams, turning defensive mazes into open roads. Within weeks, thousands of Shermans sported the Cullen device, and the advance resumed. Everywhere the Sherman went, solutions followed. Engineers didn't wait for factories, they adapted in the field. If armor was too thin, they welded spare track links or sandbags onto the hull. If visibility was bad, they added mirrors or periscopes. If mud bogged them down, they widened tracks. That adaptability came from design philosophy, a system that trusted soldiers to innovate, not wait for permission. The German army, bound by hierarchy and technical rigidity, couldn't match that agility. And while Sherman smashed through hedgerows, their network doctrine was turning the tide. Radio-equipped tank commanders coordinated with artillery and infantry units in real time. German tanks often fought blind, relying on visual signals or runners. In one recorded engagement near St. Lo, a single Sherman platoon called in 3 separate artillery barrages during an ongoing battle, walking fire across enemy positions as they maneuvered. The combination of mobility, communication, and combined arms created an unstoppable rhythm, the kind of battlefield tempo that shattered even superior weapons. Then came the breakout, Operation Cobra. When the skies cleared, Allied bombers blasted holes in the German lines, and the Shermans surged through. Dust clouds rose over the French countryside as hundreds of tanks poured into the breach. They bypassed strongpoints, encircled divisions, and kept pressing forward. The German armored counterattacks came, but the pattern repeated. Isolated heavy tanks like Tigers might kill a few Shermans before being flanked, swarmed, or stranded by fuel loss. The speed of Allied operations simply left them behind. The climax of that summer came at Araucourt. The German army, desperate to halt the American advance, launched a massive counterattack with newly formed panzer brigades. The weather was foggy, the visibility poor, conditions that should have favored the Germans. Instead, it was a disaster for them. The American 4th Armored Division, led by Colonel Bruce Clark, used its radios and mobility to devastating effect. Shermans maneuvered between the hills and hedgerows, setting ambushes and calling artillery fire with precision. Panthers appeared like ghosts through the mist, only to be destroyed one after another by coordinated fire and flanking maneuvers. Over the course of several days, the Americans destroyed over 100 German tanks while losing fewer than 30 of their own. It was proof, again, that doctrine and logistics beat raw design. Even as the Allies advanced through France, the Sherman kept evolving. Crews modified their tanks for urban combat, adding makeshift armor or using jumbos to lead assaults through city streets. The 76mm Shermans began to replace older 75mm variants in frontline units, giving them better anti-tank capability while still retaining their versatile high-explosive performance. The EZ-8 models, with their smoother suspension, proved ideal for the fast-moving operations that defined late 1944. The Sherman had started the war as a general-purpose machine, but by its end, it was a platform fine-tuned by experience. But even as Allied tankers celebrated their victories, a new challenge emerged in December: the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was the German army's last great gamble. In the frozen forests of Belgium, heavy snow and surprise attacks threw Allied lines into chaos. Once again, the Sherman was called upon to do what it did best: adapt and endure. Temperatures dropped so low that engines froze and fuel thickened into sludge. Tigers and Panthers struggled to start in the cold. Many never did. Shermans, with their simpler systems and reliable starters, fared better. They could be warmed by fires under the hull or by crews cycling the engines all night. The fighting was brutal. In towns like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, Sherman squared off against the best of the German armored forces. The jumbos led assaults through snow-choked streets, shrugging off enemy fire while their comrades fired from cover. The 76mm guns, when paired with scarce HVAP ammunition, could penetrate even Panthers from the front at close range. And when brute force wasn't enough, Allied tankers did what they always did: call in artillery, flank, and press forward. In the Ardennes, the Sherman's reliability became as decisive as its firepower. German units ran out of fuel, broke down, or were abandoned as bridges collapsed under their massive weight. Allied logistics kept the Shermans fueled, repaired, and rolling. When the skies finally cleared, the Shermans' old partners returned, the P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons. With air support unleashed, German armor was hammered into wreckage. By January 1945, the counteroffensive was broken, and the road to Germany lay open. The Sherman had weathered everything the war could throw at it. Deserts, mountains, jungles, hedgerows, snowstorms, and cities reduced to rubble. It had proven itself not by dominating duels, but by surviving campaigns. It was never the strongest or the fastest, but it was always there, and that, in war, is everything. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, columns of Shermans rolled across pontoon bridges into Germany itself. Each one was a small miracle of logistics, craftsmanship, and determination. The tank that critics mocked as a Ronson lighter had become the face of victory. In the ruins of Europe, it wasn't the Tiger that symbolized triumph. It was the Sherman, rolling past cheering crowds, its crew weary but alive. When the war finally reached Germany, the Sherman had become a familiar silhouette not just to Allied troops, but to their enemies. To many German infantrymen, the rumble of its engine and the clatter of its treads meant that their position was about to be overrun. It wasn't fear of a superweapon that haunted them. It was exhaustion from fighting an enemy that never stopped coming. Wherever they went, the Shermans were there first, and when one burned, two more followed behind it, already maneuvering, already calling for artillery or air cover. That relentlessness wasn't a coincidence. It was the deliberate result of a logistical culture that treated the tank as a renewable resource. The American system didn't just build tanks, it built the infrastructure to keep them fighting indefinitely. Field depots near the front could replace engines, swap turrets, or even re-weld armor patches. Recovery Shermans, fitted with cranes and winches, dragged crippled vehicles back to life. It was a rolling ecosystem, where a German panzer division might limp back to repair yards hundreds of kilometers away, and the American Armored Division could rebuild itself overnight. Every step into Germany was a testament to that system. The roads were choked with convoys of fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and supply trains. Mechanics worked under tarps lit by lanterns, turning the night into a continuous production line. In the morning, the tanks rolled out again, patched, fueled, and ready. The Tiger's reputation was built on the myth of invincibility. The Sherman's legacy was built on inevitability. That inevitability extended to the way the Sherman interacted with other branches of the military. In the air above, fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt became its guardian angels. The coordination between air and ground units reached a level of sophistication unheard of at the start of the war. Tank commanders carried air liaison radios, allowing them to mark targets for pilots. White smoke signaled enemy armor, colored smoke marked friendly lines. Within minutes, the sky would roar as thunderbolts dived, unleashing rockets and bombs that shattered enemy concentrations. It wasn't that the Sherman was invincible, it was that it was never alone. That idea, combined arms, was the real victory condition of the Allied war effort. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power weren't separate tools. They were limbs of the same body. The Sherman was the backbone, the mobile link that connected them all. Its radios, mobility, and reliability made coordination possible on a scale the Axis could never match. German armor often fought isolated battles, impressive but strategically meaningless. The Allies fought connected battles where every unit amplified the other. When heavy German armor did appear, the Sherman didn't face it with brute force. It faced it with strategy. Fireflies would set up in overwatch positions while standard Shermans advanced under cover of smoke. Artillery would pound suspected ambush points before the tanks even arrived. If a Tiger appeared, one unit would bait it while others maneuvered for flank shots. If that failed, air power or tank destroyers were called in. The myth of the Sherman swarm was really the manifestation of this doctrine. Not a mindless rush, but a coordinated, multi-layered assault that overwhelmed through precision, not chaos. The numbers tell the story. At its peak, the U.S. Army operated more than 10,000 Shermans in Europe alone. British and Commonwealth forces added thousands more. Each one was supported by a network of trucks, mechanics, fuel depots, and supply ships that spanned continents. For every tank that burned, another was already on the way from a port in Antwerp or Cherbourg. The German armored corps, by contrast, was shrinking. Even when new Panthers or Tigers reached the front, there were never enough of them, never enough fuel, never enough parts. Their presence made headlines. The Sherman made history. By early 1945, German tank commanders knew the futility of the situation. Reports from captured officers describe frustration not at the Sherman's firepower, but at its persistence. "We kill one and 5 more appear," one wrote. "They repair faster than we can destroy." The Tiger could win a battle, but the Sherman could win a war of days. And when the Sherman wasn't fighting, it was solving problems. Its dozer variants cleared rubble in captured towns. Its bridge-layer versions spanned rivers under fire. Its flamethrower conversions burned out fortified positions that artillery couldn't reach. There was no problem too specific, no task too small. The Sherman had a version for it. In the massive Allied war machine, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a utility tool, a problem solver on tracks. The final months of the war were brutal, but they also highlighted the sheer durability of the Sherman's concept. The German army was on the defensive, desperate, fighting from city to city. Tanks fought street by street, often within spitting distance. The Sherman's smaller size, good visibility, and relatively quick turret traverse made it ideal for such close combat. In places like Cologne and Aachen, Shermans engaged in duels through alleyways, punching through walls to flank enemy armor. One famous gun camera clip from Cologne shows a Sherman trading shots with a Panther across a plaza. The American crew fired, the round struck true, and the Panther exploded. It was a perfect encapsulation of the entire war, the supposed underdog, winning through precision and nerve. When victory finally came, the Sherman had left its mark on every front. In Europe, it had driven from the beaches to Berlin. In the Pacific, it had crushed Japanese fortifications from Saipan to Okinawa. In North Africa, it had outlasted Rommel's panzers and chased them into the sea. In Italy, it had climbed mountains and blasted through stone towns. There was no environment it hadn't conquered, no mission it hadn't adapted to. And yet, even as the war ended, the Sherman story was far from over. The world didn't stop needing tanks when peace returned. It just needed them for different wars. In Korea, surplus Shermans once again rumbled into combat, facing T-34s in duels that echoed the past. Many of those tanks had fought in Europe only a few years earlier, rebuilt, repainted, and sent back to battle. They were older, but still deadly. In the Middle East, the Sherman became the unlikely champion of Israel. Upgraded with French 75mm high-velocity guns and new engines, the M50 and M51 Super Shermans went to war again, this time against Soviet-built armor. During the Six-Day War of 1967, these descendants of World War II veterans destroyed modern T-54s and T-55s, proving that the design still had fight left in it. It's hard to imagine a better testament to engineering resilience, a tank born in 1941 still winning battles in the jet age. Even nations far from the major powers kept their Shermans running. South American armies used them into the 1980s. Museums and collectors today still fire up the engines and drive them across fields, 70 years after they were first built. There's something poetic about that. A machine designed for the harshest war in history, still alive, still functional, still moving forward. That's what the Sherman always did, move forward. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was awash in Shermans. They stood on every front, in every theater, with every flag. From the sands of Tunisia to the ruins of Berlin, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Pacific, the Sherman had become a monument to endurance. Yet its story didn't end in the silence after victory. In many ways, that was when it truly began to shape history. The post-war world was one of new borders and old grudges, and tanks, symbols of power and independence, were suddenly in demand everywhere. The Sherman became the default answer. The U.S. Army had tens of thousands left over, and they flowed into every corner of the globe. Allies, new nations, even former colonies received them through aid programs and sales. For a generation, the Sherman became the world's starter tank. But those who bought them didn't just inherit history, they reinvented it. Nations with limited resources found that the Sherman's simplicity was its greatest gift. You could maintain it without massive industrial infrastructure. You could upgrade it with locally available parts. It was the Lego set of armored warfare, infinitely rebuildable. In Latin America, in the Middle East, and across Asia, workshops fitted Shermans with new engines, new turrets, and even new guns. The chassis that had once fought in Normandy was reborn again and again under different flags. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in Israel. In the 1950s, as the young nation scrambled to defend itself, Surplus Shermans arrived from France and other countries. They were old, some battered, but they worked, and more importantly, they could be improved. Israeli engineers collaborating with the French fitted them with high-velocity 75mm and later 105mm guns, powerful engines, and new suspensions. These Super Shermans, the M50 and M51, looked like relics of an older war, but when they rolled into battle in 1956 and again in 1967, they proved anything but obsolete. In the Six-Day War, Israeli Shermans, modernized veterans of World War II, faced off against Egyptian and Syrian T-54s and T-55s, tanks 2 generations newer and theoretically far superior. But history repeated itself. The Shermans weren't the fastest or strongest, but they were reliable, well-coordinated, and expertly crewed. Israeli tactics emphasized mobility, flanking, and combined arms. The same lessons the Allies had learned decades earlier. Once again, the tank that shouldn't have won did exactly that. The world watched as Shermans, thought to be museum pieces, helped secure some of the most decisive victories in modern armored history. There's something poetic about that. A design built for the last war, still relevant in the next. The Sherman had transcended its time. It wasn't just a machine, it was a philosophy. Reliability over luxury, numbers over novelty, communication over isolation. The same principles that won World War II were proving themselves again in the Cold War's proxy conflicts. But even beyond the battlefield, the Sherman left fingerprints everywhere. Its design language, 3-man turret, ergonomic controls, focus on logistics, became the template for future generations of tanks. The American M26 Pershing, which replaced it at the end of the war, owed much to its predecessor's lessons. Later, the M46, M47, and eventually the M48 patent line carried those ideas forward. Even the modern M1 Abrams, with all its digital sophistication, still reflects the same priorities: crew survivability, mobility, and the ability to sustain long campaigns. The DNA of the Sherman never really left. Its cultural legacy was just as enduring. In post-war films, memoirs, and literature, the Sherman became both a symbol of heroism and humility. It wasn't the mythical juggernaut. It was the soldier's tank, the one that brought ordinary men home. Veterans who had cursed it in North Africa or Normandy often wrote later with affection. They understood that while it wasn't perfect, it had been dependable. It was the tank that always started, that always got them to the next fight, and that gave them a chance to live. And perhaps that's the greatest difference between the Sherman and its adversaries. The Tiger inspired fear, the Sherman inspired trust. The Tiger was a weapon of prestige, the Sherman was a weapon of perseverance. The former turned heads, the latter turned tides. In retrospect, it's easy to measure a tank by statistics: armor thickness, penetration, muzzle velocity. But those numbers miss the forest for the trees. War isn't won by specs, it's won by systems. The Sherman was part of a system so efficient, so relentless, that it overwhelmed even the most sophisticated enemy designs. Every time a Tiger killed a Sherman, there were replacement tanks, replacement crews, replacement parts. The German factories couldn't match that tempo. Their obsession with quality became their downfall. Think of it this way: the Panther and Tiger were race cars, fast, powerful, but fragile. The Sherman was a truck, steady, reliable, unstoppable. In a short race, the race car wins. In a cross-country endurance rally, the truck does. The Allies weren't racing for highlights, they were fighting for survival across continents. When we look at the myth of the bad Sherman, what we're really seeing is the distortion of expectations. We're measuring a tank built for operations against tanks built for duels. The Germans built for the arena, the Americans built for the map. That's why the Panther looked better in isolated engagements, but lost the war that actually mattered, the logistical one. It's also why so many modern historians have revisited the Sherman's record with new respect. When you step back from anecdotal kill ratios and look at the broader data, the Sherman's combat performance is astonishingly efficient. In engagements where the Allies had combined arms support, which was most of them, the Sherman's loss rates were entirely acceptable, often comparable to or even better than German counterparts once mechanical breakdowns were counted. When you factor in availability, the Sherman outperformed almost everything it faced. And yet the internet loves a villain, or in this case, a victim. The image of the flaming coffin persists, even though it's been disproven for decades. It's an easy narrative: underdog tank, brave crews, cruel odds. But that story robs the Sherman of its real accomplishment. It wasn't the victim of the war, it was the victor. The irony is that the same design decisions that led to its mockery are the reasons it won. It wasn't heavy because it had to cross bridges. It wasn't overgunned because it had to support infantry. It wasn't fancy because it had to be fixed in the field. Everything critics called a weakness was, in truth, a deliberate trade-off for mobility, versatility, and sustainability. The Sherman wasn't trying to be perfect. It was trying to be everywhere. And that's exactly what it became. That's why, even decades later, when historians talk about the tank that won the war, they don't mean the Tiger or the Panther or the T-34. They mean the one that got the job done. The one that kept moving when others stopped. The one that didn't need to be the best, just needed to be enough. And enough, in the hands of millions of determined soldiers, was everything. To understand why the Sherman became such a legend, not of glamour, but of grit, you have to look at what it represented as much as what it did. The Sherman was a physical embodiment of democratic warfare, mass-produced, standardized, and shared among allies. It was built not for prestige, but for practicality. It symbolized the idea that victory came not from one perfect machine, but from the coordinated effort of millions of people working in harmony. It was a tank built by an entire nation, not just an army. Every rivet and weld told a story of scale. In the vast industrial heartlands of America, factories that once produced sedans and tractors shifted overnight to manufacturing weapons of war. Workers who had never touched a tank before became experts through sheer repetition. The design was simple enough that it could be understood, assembled, and maintained by average citizens turned war workers. It was, in a very real sense, a democratized weapon. This scale mattered. The Sherman wasn't just mass-produced, it was mass-integrated. The same tank design rolled into battle under American, British, Canadian, free, French, Polish, South African, and Soviet flags. In an age before globalized manufacturing, that level of standardization was unprecedented. It meant that spare parts, manuals, and ammunition could be shared across entire coalitions. In Italy, a British crew might cannibalize parts from an American depot. In North Africa, free French mechanics could repair their Shermans using Canadian components. It was a global network of warfighting efficiency, an alliance connected by bolts and blueprints. That's the hidden brilliance of the Sherman story. It wasn't just a tank that won the war. It was a tank that enabled an alliance to function. The Axis powers could never match that kind of integration. German and Italian tanks used different guns, different calibers, different transmissions. Japanese tanks were entirely separate from anything on the European front. Each Axis partner fought their own war, mechanically and logistically. The Allies fought one unified campaign, and the Sherman was its rolling ambassador. And beyond the battlefield, the Sherman taught lessons that outlived the war itself. It proved that design elegance wasn't about complexity, it was about purpose. Every curve of its hull, every angle of its armor, every component of its drivetrain existed for a reason. It wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to function. That's why so many Shermans still run today, 70, 80 years later. They were built to be repaired, not worshipped. Contrast that with the German approach, where over-engineering became a self-inflicted wound. The Tiger's intricate overlapping road wheels were brilliant on paper but froze solid in mud and ice. Its heavy armor made it unstoppable in a duel but unmovable in a retreat. Its 80mm gun was unmatched, but its ammunition was scarce and its maintenance demands absurd. The Panther, though deadly, was a nightmare to service. Mechanics often needed cranes just to reach key components. When the German army needed simplicity, it had luxury instead. The Sherman's triumph, then, was philosophical. It was the victory of systems over singularity, of process over perfection. It was proof that the true weapon of war isn't innovation, it's organization. Nowhere was that clearer than in the American approach to maintenance. Unlike the Germans, who often treated tanks as specialized instruments, the Americans treated them as consumable assets. A tank was expected to fight, break, be repaired, and fight again. That required an entire ecosystem of support. Behind every Sherman at the front were dozens of men, mechanics, drivers, supply clerks, engineers, each one part of the chain that kept it moving. The U.S. Army even fielded armored recovery vehicles, many built from damaged Shermans, whose sole purpose was to pull other tanks out of the mud or back from the line. This focus on sustainment was revolutionary. The Sherman wasn't a solo fighter. It was part of a self-healing organism. Even if a Entire battalion was battered one day. By the next, half of those tanks could be back in action. Compare that to the German situation in 1944, when entire divisions would grind to a halt because their tanks couldn't be repaired in time. Allied commanders understood that momentum wins wars, not isolated victories. Every repaired Sherman meant one more weapon on the move, one more inch of ground gained. And it wasn't just about machines. The Sherman created an environment where crews became experts in survival and adaptation. Many veterans spoke of their tanks almost like family. They named them, decorated them, and tinkered with them constantly. In an era when a single shell could decide life or death, that bond mattered. It gave crews ownership and pride, and it encouraged ingenuity. If a hatch stuck, they fixed it. If visibility was poor, they rigged mirrors. They didn't wait for orders. They acted. That self-reliance turned tank units into creative laboratories. Field workshops produced innovations that eventually filtered up the chain of command. The duckbill track extenders that improved traction in mud, invented by soldiers. The Cullen cutter that transformed hedgerow warfare. The idea of a sergeant, not an engineer. The Sherman's adaptability wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. It empowered ordinary people to solve extraordinary problems. The results were visible in the pace of Allied operations. While German units often bogged down, the Americans and their allies moved with relentless speed. They didn't wait for perfect conditions, they made them. Shermans led convoys across rickety bridges, forged through flooded roads, and climbed slopes that maps declared impassable. The phrase, "keep 'em rolling," became an unofficial motto. The tank's greatest weapon was not its gun, it was its availability. And that availability turned into a psychological weapon. German soldiers came to dread the sheer inevitability of the Allied advance. Even after winning a skirmish, they knew it didn't matter. The Shermans would return, patched up, refueled, rearmed. They were like an armored tide, constant, unending, impossible to resist. For every tiger prowling a forest, there were 10 Shermans crossing bridges, another 20 being offloaded from ships, and 100 more being assembled in Detroit. It's no wonder that after the war, German generals writing their memoirs expressed a grudging respect for the Sherman. They admitted it was never their technical equal, but it was their operational superior. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded armored divisions on both the eastern and western fronts, summed it up best. The Americans made war easy for themselves in the best sense. Their equipment was simple, reliable, and available in overwhelming numbers. It was a pleasure to fight with such weapons. That was the Sherman's legacy, not fear, but admiration. It didn't need to inspire awe. It just needed to work. As the war drew to its close, the Sherman had become the beating heart of Allied operations. It wasn't just a tank in the field. It was the hinge that connected entire campaigns together. When you look at the great offensives of 1944 and 1945, from the Normandy breakout to the crossing of the Rhine, the common denominator wasn't air power or artillery alone. It was the humble, steady advance of the Sherman, leading supply convoys, pushing infantry forward, and never letting the enemy rest. To understand its significance, imagine what it meant to the men following behind it. For the infantry slogging through mud and smoke, the sight of that familiar rounded turret meant safety. It meant someone was up there watching, ready to fire high-explosive shells into the tree line or machine gun nests pinning them down. The Sherman wasn't just a weapon. It was a moving shield, a companion. Soldiers learned to march to its rhythm, using its armor as cover, calling its crew by name. There was a strange intimacy to it, a man and his tank, metal and flesh, fighting side by side across the ruined landscape of Europe. That relationship between the Sherman and the infantry explains why it was so effective despite its supposed limitations. While German armor tended to operate independently, hunting enemy tanks or holding isolated positions, Allied tanks were inseparable from their foot soldiers. The Sherman's gun was designed with this cooperation in mind. The 75 mm high explosive round was devastating against bunkers, machine gun nests, and soft targets, precisely the threats that stalled infantry advances. Even when the gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor, it could still wipe out the infantry supporting it. The tank didn't need to win duels, it needed to keep the offensive moving. And move it did. As the Allies crossed France, the Sherman became a logistical juggernaut. Supply convoys, the famous Red Ball Express, rushed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across newly liberated territory. The entire system revolved around keeping the tanks rolling. At maintenance depots, damaged Shermans arrived daily, stripped for usable components, repaired, and sent back into battle. Nothing was wasted. A tank that burned one day could return a week later with a new turret, new engine, and the same crew smiling behind its hatches. That kind of efficiency was unthinkable to the Germans, whose complex machinery required delicate care and specialized equipment. The Tiger might have been terrifying, but once disabled, it often stayed that way. A thrown track or an overheated gearbox could end its career. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be fixed with a wrench and welding torch. It wasn't invincible, but it was immortal in the way that mattered most. It could come back. And that mattered, because the closer the Allies came to Germany, the more desperate the fighting became. Cities like Aachen, Metz, and Cologne turned into labyrinths of rubble where tank combat took on a brutal intimacy. A Sherman could turn a corner and find itself face-to-face with an anti-tank gun or a hidden Panther. These were duels fought at point-blank range, where quick reflexes and teamwork decided who lived. The Sherman's smaller profile and faster turret traverse often gave it the edge. German tanks, designed for long-range engagements, struggled to react in the confined spaces of bombed-out cities. In Cologne, one of the most famous tank duels of the war was captured on film. A Sherman, moving cautiously through the ruins, spotted a Panther ahead. The crews exchanged shots. The first Sherman round ricocheted harmlessly off the Panther's armor, but the second hit true, igniting the German tank in a flash of flame. It wasn't luck. It was coordination, training, and calm under pressure. That footage would later become an icon, a symbol of the Sherman's resilience and the courage of its crews. Even in defeat, the Sherman demonstrated its value. When a tank was knocked out, the crew often survived. The internal layout, roomy by tank standards, gave men space to escape. Many lived to fight another day, to crew another Sherman. The German tanks might have been thicker-skinned, but their cramped interiors were death traps when penetrated. The Sherman, by contrast, prioritized people. It was a war machine designed with human lives in mind, and that design philosophy paid dividends. And as the Allies finally reached the Rhine, that same philosophy extended beyond the battlefield. The Sherman wasn't just a killer, it was a builder. Dozer-equipped variants cleared roads, pushed wreckage into rivers, and carved new crossings for advancing troops. Others served as armored bridge layers, laying steel spans under enemy fire. These specialized Shermans turned geography itself into an ally. They made movement possible where none should have been. For every tank that fired a shot in anger, there was another working quietly to ensure the war machine could keep rolling forward. When the first American tanks crossed the Rhine at Remagen, they were Shermans. Their treads clattered across the bridge as artillery thundered overhead, and for the first time, Allied armor rolled into the heart of Nazi Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable. The tank so often mocked for being average had carried the Allies from North Africa to Berlin. It had done the impossible. It had stayed in the fight from the first day to the last. And in doing so, it proved something profound about warfare. The best machine is not the one that dominates the battlefield in theory, it's the one that endures the battlefield in practice. The Sherman wasn't an apex predator. It was a survivor. It absorbed every blow, learned every lesson, and evolved faster than its enemies. Its crews made it better, its engineers made it smarter, and its factories made it forever available. It wasn't a monument to engineering brilliance. It was a monument to persistence. When the final German cities fell and Allied troops marched through the ruins, the Shermans rolled in beside them, scarred and soot-stained, their armor pitted from months of fighting. They were worn down, patched together with field welds and replacement parts from a dozen other tanks, but they still ran. Some had names painted on their sides: Lucky Lady, Thunderbolt, Fury, Bastogne Belle. Each name told a story. They weren't just machines. They were living artifacts of the men who drove them and the war they carried on their backs. As peace returned, those same tanks would help rebuild what they'd once destroyed. In shattered towns, Shermans were used to clear rubble, haul supplies, and even serve as mobile power sources. Their engines, once tuned for war, now hummed for reconstruction. They had survived the greatest conflict in human history and now became tools for renewal. There was something poetic in that transformation, from destroyers to rebuilders, from instruments of death to engines of hope. And when they were finally retired, many weren't scrapped. They were preserved, placed in parks, in front of memorials, in museums. Children climbed their hulls, veterans touched the cold steel, remembering the sound of the engine and the smell of oil. The tiger and panther became rare curiosities, trophies of a lost cause. The Sherman became common again, not because it was ordinary, but because it had won. By the spring of 1945, the Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was the embodiment of the Allied advance itself. Wherever it went, liberation followed. Villagers waved as columns rumbled past. Children perched on the rear decks. Soldiers leaned out of hatches, grinning beneath their helmets. For many civilians across Europe, the first sign that the nightmare of occupation was ending wasn't the arrival of generals or flags. It was the growl of a Sherman engine echoing down the street. It's easy to forget how deeply that sound was woven into the soundtrack of liberation. The Sherman wasn't merely a piece of war machinery, it was the physical expression of deliverance. When people saw its olive-drab hull crest a hill, they knew that safety, or at least a chance at it, was near. It symbolized momentum, a promise that the relentless push of freedom hadn't stopped, even after years of suffering. And perhaps that was the secret of its strange immortality. The tiger and panther may have commanded fear, but the Sherman commanded hope. It represented something larger than steel, the idea that perseverance and practicality could overcome terror and tyranny. Every dent and scratch on its hull told a story not just of survival, but of the system that made survival possible. That system, the vast machinery of Allied logistics, was as awe-inspiring as any wonder weapon. The Sherman was its messenger. Each one that reached the front carried with it the labor of tens of thousands of hands, miners who dug the ore, welders who shaped the plates, drivers who ferried supplies across the ocean. When it rolled onto a European road, it was followed invisibly by an entire continent's worth of effort. No German tank, no matter how formidable, had that kind of world behind it. And yet, even amid that massive scale, the Sherman remained intimate. Every crew gave their tank a name, a personality, a soul. Some names were fierce: Hellcat, Widowmaker, Problem Child. Others were tender: Doris, Miss Detroit, Betty Jane. Crews painted pinups, slogans, and jokes on the armor, tiny rebellions against the uniformity of war. The Sherman was standardized but never impersonal. Each one carried the fingerprints of its crew, a lucky charm on the dashboard, a family photo taped beside the sight, a tally of kills scrawled in chalk. Inside, the space was cramped but familiar. The smell of oil and cordite, the hum of the engine, the chatter on the radio. To those who lived inside it, the tank was both prison and home. Some crews joked that they felt safer inside their metal box than outside of it. Others confessed to feeling entombed by it, knowing that one lucky enemy shot could turn their world into fire. Yet they climbed in every morning, started the engines, and rolled forward. The Sherman wasn't just a machine of war. It was a crucible of courage. The psychological balance between fear and faith defined the Sherman's crews. They knew the tank's reputation. They'd heard the stories, the jokes about it being a Ronson that lit up every time. But they also knew something the mythmakers didn't: that with wet stowage, with better tactics, with teamwork, their odds were improving every day. They didn't see their tank as a death trap. They saw it as a chance to move, to fight, to survive. That chance was more than many soldiers ever got, and those chances multiplied as the war neared its end. At the Rhine, Sherman spearheaded crossings under fire. At Remagen, they rolled across the captured Ludendorff Bridge, the first Allied armor to breach Germany's last natural barrier. In Italy, they climbed mountains that engineers had called impassable. In the Pacific, they churned through jungles and coral sand, their 75mm guns blasting through bunkers that no infantry charge could touch. The Sherman was everywhere, doing everything, and every success fed the legend. That legend only grew stronger after the war. Veterans carried it home, their stories shaping public memory. They didn't talk about muzzle velocities or armor thickness, they talked about trust. "She always started," they'd say. "She got us there." That refrain echoed through generations. The Sherman's real victory wasn't mechanical, it was emotional. It gave ordinary men the extraordinary faith that they could face chaos and live through it. That faith echoed even into the post-war decades. The Sherman became a fixture of military parades, memorials, and museums. Children climbed on them, veterans saluted them, and filmmakers rediscovered them. Hollywood fell in love with the Sherman because it wasn't glamorous. It was human. In movies like A Bridge Too Far, Kelly's Heroes, and later Fury, the tank wasn't portrayed as invincible, it was portrayed as something better, dependable, flawed, and real. And then came the historians, the mythbusters who looked back with data instead of anecdotes. They found that the Sherman's fire hazard was wildly overstated, that its kill ratios improved dramatically by late 1944, and that its combat readiness eclipsed that of its foes. They realized that the stories told by early critics, especially those from German veterans eager to defend their reputations, had exaggerated the Sherman's weaknesses and minimized its strengths. The narrative of the inferior American tank started to crumble under the weight of evidence. By the late 20th century, the Sherman's reputation was undergoing a renaissance. Military analysts began to appreciate its design for what it really was, a masterpiece of systems thinking. They saw it not as a symbol of mediocrity, but of mastery, the understanding that wars are not won by perfect machines, but by coherent, maintainable, and adaptable ones. In engineering circles, it became a case study in how simplicity can outperform sophistication. Even modern armored doctrine owes a debt to the Sherman. The idea that every tank must be part of a combined arms network, that crew visibility and communication matter more than raw numbers, that logistics are the ultimate weapon, these principles trace directly back to the M4. The Sherman may have been retired, but its blueprint lives on in every Abrams, Leopard, and Challenger rolling today. The radios are digital now, the armor composite, the guns computer-stabilized, but the spirit is the same. It's fitting, then, that the Sherman endures not just in museums, but in motion. Around the world, enthusiasts and historians still restore and drive them. They roar to life at reenactments and commemorations, their engines coughing, their tracks clanking like echoes from the past. When they move, they remind us that this machine, born in crisis, mocked in peace, helped shape the very world we live in. In the end, that's what separates the Sherman from the rest. The Tiger, the Panther, the T-34. They were weapons of their moment. The Sherman was a weapon of continuity. It connected continents, allies, generations. It taught lessons that outlasted its wars. It may not have been perfect, but it was enough. And enough, multiplied by determination and unity, changed history. By the time the Sherman's treads had rolled across the Rhine and into Germany's heart, it was clear that this wasn't just a tank, it was a manifestation of the Allied grand strategy. Every moving part of the war effort, industry, logistics, manpower, and innovation converged into that steel hull. It was the physical embodiment of the phrase total war, where entire societies had mobilized to produce a single purpose, to win, decisively and completely. It's almost poetic how misunderstood the Sherman became afterward. Popular memory loves monsters, the tigers, the king tigers, the armored legends that roamed battlefields like mechanical dragons. The Sherman, by comparison, was a workhorse, plain and unromantic. But that plainness was its power. Where the Tiger represented an empire's pride, the Sherman represented a coalition's practicality. It wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to endure. In those final months of the war, as German resistance stiffened and Allied units pushed through towns reduced to dust, the Sherman's role shifted once again. It became the diplomat of destruction, the tank that appeared in every surrender photograph, parked at every crossroads, its barrel resting quietly as soldiers handed over their rifles. For civilians, it was a symbol that the fighting had ended. For soldiers, it was proof that all the hardship, all the endless convoys and bloody fields had led somewhere. And as Europe's cities burned and then began to rebuild, the Sherman kept working. It hauled wreckage, dragged artillery into position, and powered generators. Its engine, that throaty, mechanical heartbeat, hummed in places where life was returning after years of silence. The same tank that had once shattered walls now helped clear them. The paradox was striking. A weapon designed for destruction now serving as the first tool of reconstruction. But even as peace dawned, the Sherman refused to fade quietly. Around the world, it found new purposes, new identities. It fought in Korea, where it met its spiritual successor, the T-34, on the icy hills and valleys. The duels were fierce, but the old Sherman held its own, especially when supported by superior American air power and coordination. Once again, its reliability and crew training compensated for any technical disadvantage. In the Middle East, as tensions flared through the 1950s and 60s, the Sherman appeared under new flags, its familiar shape transformed by ingenuity. The Israeli Defense Forces took discarded Shermans and, through sheer necessity, turned them into world-class fighting machines. With French CN 7550 high-velocity guns and later 105mm D1504s, they became the M50 and M51 Super Shermans. Upgraded suspensions, new diesel engines, and improved optics gave them new life. These tanks fought and won in Sinai and the Golan Heights, outmaneuvering and outshooting modern Soviet designs. That image, a 25-year-old Sherman cresting a desert ridge, its gun recoiling as a T-54 erupts in flame, captures everything about its legacy. The Sherman was more than a weapon. It was an idea. You could modernize it, adapt it, make it relevant, again and again because it was built with flexibility in its bones. Its chassis became the skeleton for countless variants: artillery carriers, command tanks, recovery vehicles, anti-aircraft platforms, amphibious and flamethrower tanks. The M4 was less a single design than a family of possibilities, and those possibilities went beyond combat. In the decades after the war, surplus Shermans became training tools, engineering platforms, and even movie stars. Their distinctive shape, that iconic rounded turret and sloping armor, appeared in films, documentaries, and museums worldwide. It became shorthand for World War II itself, recognizable even to those who couldn't tell a Panzer from a Pershing. That visual familiarity is part of why the Sherman remains beloved. It feels like the everyman of tanks, the mechanical embodiment of the ordinary soldier. What's remarkable is how much modern armored warfare still echoes lessons learned from the Sherman. The idea that reliability trumps raw power, that visibility and communication are more important than armor thickness. That coordination between branches, air, infantry, and armor multiplies effectiveness exponentially. These ideas are the foundation of every major military doctrine that followed. When modern commanders speak of combined arms, they're really describing the blueprint the Sherman helped pioneer. Even technologically, the Sherman was ahead of its time in subtle ways. Its gyro stabilizer, often misunderstood or underused early on, was a primitive precursor to modern fire control systems. It allowed gunners to fire more accurately on the move, something few other tanks could do then. Its standard radio equipment gave it a communications edge over Axis forces that often relied on visual signals. Its ergonomic layout, with a three-man turret that freed the commander to focus on leadership rather than gunnery, became the global standard. All these details reveal a deeper truth. The Sherman wasn't mediocre. It was mature. It was a machine that understood the assignment. It didn't try to dominate the battlefield alone. It amplified everything around it. It was never the hero in isolation. It was the enabler of collective victory. That's why it succeeded where so many super tanks failed. The story of the Sherman, then, isn't just a tale of steel and strategy. It's a mirror reflecting the society that made it. Democratic, industrious, adaptable, flawed, but determined. The tank was America's industrial soul made manifest, but it was also something more universal, a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. In the hands of crews from half a dozen nations, it became a shared language of warfare, one that spoke of teamwork, trust, and persistence. When historians compare it to the Tiger or the Panther, they often focus on the technical gap. And yes, in a vacuum, those German tanks were superior. But wars aren't fought in vacuums. They're fought in mud, rain, snow, and chaos. And that's where the Sherman thrived. It was the tank that showed up, the one that didn't break down halfway to the battle, the one that got there on time, with fuel in its tank, ammo in its racks, and a crew that knew exactly what to do. If perfection is the enemy of good, then the Sherman was the revenge of the good. Good enough, often enough, everywhere it mattered. And that's what made it unstoppable. Even now, decades later, when you stand beside one of those preserved Shermans in a museum or park, there's an unmistakable presence about it. It doesn't look menacing, it looks purposeful. The armor is scarred but solid. The gun, stubby compared to modern cannons, still points forward with quiet confidence. It's not a monster, it's a monument, a symbol of work, sacrifice, and endurance. And as you touch that cold metal, you realize something profound. This was the tank that won not by fear, but by faith. Faith in systems, in crews, in industry, in each other. The Tiger was a masterpiece. The Sherman was a movement. Standing beside a Sherman today, you can almost hear its history humming through the steel. It doesn't boast. It doesn't need to. Its presence tells its story. a story of men and machines that fought not for glory, but for victory that would last. The Tiger and Panther were technological marvels. The Sherman was a logistical miracle. And in the brutal arithmetic of total war, it was logistics that decided the outcome. You could see that truth play out across every theater of the Second World War. In North Africa, the Sherman didn't just replace the aging Grants and Lees, it transformed the battlefield. When the first M4s rolled into Tunisia in late 1942, their reliability and cross-country performance stunned even hardened British crews. Against the Panzer III and early the IV, they were equals, sometimes superiors. And while the Germans struggled with mechanical breakdowns in the desert heat, the Shermans kept rolling. They outlasted their opponents. In an environment where survival was measured in miles before maintenance, the Sherman's endurance became its deadliest weapon. In Italy, that endurance was tested in an entirely different way. Mountains, mud, and medieval towns turned tank warfare into a slow, grinding climb. German defenders turned every ridge into a fortress. But the Sherman adapted. Engineers fitted some with dozer blades to clear roads, others with bridging gear to cross rivers, and many with the infamous Kulin hedgerow cutters, repurposed to chew through stone walls. Its versatility allowed armored columns to keep supporting infantry even in terrain that should have immobilized them. The Panther's 75mm gun could pierce armor, but the Sherman's 75mm could pierce defenses. Then came Normandy, the crucible. It's here that the Sherman's reputation was forged, both its myths and its truths. Critics often point to the early losses, to the shocking moments when Shermans burned in fields under German ambushes. And yes, those tragedies were real. But they were not the whole story. The bocage country of Normandy was unlike any battlefield in Europe, a claustrophobic maze of hedgerows that negated visibility and forced engagements at suicidal ranges. In those conditions, every tank, even a Tiger, could die in seconds. What separated success from failure wasn't armor thickness, it was adaptation. And adapt the Allies did. They welded on the Cullen device, trained in rapid flanking maneuvers, and began pairing Fireflies, the British Shermans with 17-pounder guns, with standard models in each troop. The Firefly's long barrel became the nightmare of every German tanker, capable of knocking out even Tigers from 1,000 meters. American units soon followed suit, upgrading to 76mm armed variants and coordinating closely with tank destroyers and artillery. By late 1944, the Sherman's battlefield record looked nothing like it had at D-Day. Its firepower, coordination, and tactical use had matured, a living organism evolving under pressure. At Ericourt, that evolution reached its apex. In September 1944, under fog-shrouded skies in eastern France, outnumbered American tankers of the 4th Armored Division faced waves of Panthers and other German armor. On paper, the battle should have been a massacre. Instead, the Shermans, using their superior radios, mobility, and tactical cunning, turned it into a rout. The fog that blinded the Germans became the Americans' ally. They maneuvered faster, struck from the flanks, and called in artillery and airstrikes with surgical precision. By the end, over 100 German tanks were destroyed. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. It was the perfect demonstration of how systems beat specs. But perhaps no theater showed the Sherman's range quite like the Pacific. Against the Japanese, the Sherman wasn't dueling armor. It was fighting terrain and fortifications. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, it became a bunker buster, using its high explosive rounds and flamethrower conversions to root out defenders. The Pacific's jungles and beaches destroyed lesser machines, but the Sherman, waterproofed, reinforced, and ingeniously modified, thrived. It was the tank that adapted to everything, from coral reefs to volcanic ash. Its influence extended even beyond the front lines. The recovery Shermans, the ARVs, and dozer variants were unsung heroes. They turned disaster into opportunity, pulling crippled tanks out of ditches, clearing debris, and repairing roads under fire. They embodied the same philosophy as their combat counterparts. Don't stop moving. If you can't fight, fix. If you can't fix, haul. If you can't haul, help someone else move forward. That mindset, momentum at all costs, is what ultimately won the war. The German army, bound by perfectionism, couldn't keep up. For every Tiger that broke down, there were a dozen Shermans already on the next road. Every time the Axis tried to create a decisive weapon, the Allies countered with a decisive process. That's why, in the end, the war wasn't decided in the duels of Normandy or the ambushes of the Ardennes. It was decided in the factories, the rail yards, and the shipping lanes. The Sherman was the link between all those places. It was what made industrial output real. You could produce all the steel and shells you wanted, but unless you had a machine to bring that power to the battlefield, it was meaningless. The Sherman turned industrial might into battlefield motion. It turned logistics into strategy. And its influence didn't fade when the war ended. The principles behind it became doctrine. In military academies around the world, officers studied the Sherman's campaign record not for its kills, but for its availability rate. Armored warfare, they realized, wasn't about who could destroy the most. It was about who could stay operational the longest. A tank that fights every day is worth more than one that fights perfectly once a week. The Sherman proved that truth beyond question. Even its most controversial features in hindsight were signs of foresight. The gasoline engine, maligned for being flammable, offered better cold weather reliability and logistical simplicity. The thinner armor meant greater transportability. You could fit more tanks per ship, more per train, more across a bridge. The 75mm gun, though modest in penetration, was devastating against soft targets and ideal for supporting infantry. Every design compromise made sense when viewed through the lens of global warfare. The Sherman wasn't built for one duel, it was built for all of them. And so, long after the last shots were fired, it rolled on, through Korea, through the Sinai, through training grounds from Canada to Chile. Each time it appeared, it carried with it that same lesson. Wars are not won by perfect machines, but by perfect cooperation. That was the Sherman's genius. It wasn't faster, stronger, or deadlier. It was better connected. It made everything around it more effective, from the supply trucks that refueled it to the pilots overhead who answered its radio calls. The Sherman didn't just fight battles, it synchronized them. And that, more than anything, is why the tank that everyone loves to roast might actually be the one that won the world. When people argue about the best tank of World War II, they usually imagine a duel, two machines on an empty field, nose to nose, guns loaded. It's an appealing fantasy, simple and cinematic. But that's not how wars are won. Wars are won in mud, in supply lines, in radio chatter, and in the thousands of little mechanical miracles that keep armies moving. By that measure, the Sherman wasn't just good, it was decisive. The idea of tank duels has always been seductive. You can picture the scene, a Panther crouched in ambush, a Sherman rolling into view, both crews spotting each other at the same instant. One shell screams out, one tank burns, and history gets reduced to that single moment. But what the duel myth leaves out is everything else. The artillery spotters who called coordinates, the mechanics who tuned the engines, the radio operators linking squads, the pilots overhead ready to pounce on any muzzle flash. The Sherman was never meant to fight alone. It was meant to be part of an orchestra, and in that orchestra, it was the conductor's baton. Even in the heat of battle, that coordination mattered more than raw numbers. Take the Battle of the Bulge, for instance. The German counterattack in the winter of 1944 was their last gamble, an attempt to split Allied lines and capture Antwerp. The Wehrmacht threw in its heaviest armor, Panthers, King Tigers, the best it had left. The Allies countered not with a super tank, but with an army of Shermans, supported by artillery, aircraft, and logistics so efficient that damaged tanks were being repaired and returned to the front within days. The Tigers may have been monsters, but they were monsters starving for fuel. The Shermans had gas, ammo, food, and reinforcements. That was the difference. The tank that kept moving, even slowly, would always beat the one that stalled. And no tank moved more than the Sherman. Its mechanical reliability bordered on legendary by the end of the war. American tank battalions often reported 80–90% operational readiness, even during sustained campaigns. German armored units, in contrast, struggled to keep more than half their vehicles running at any given time. That wasn't because the Germans didn't know how to build. They knew all too well. They built like artists. The Americans built like engineers. The difference showed every time a Sherman climbed a hill while a Panther blew a final drive in a ditch. And reliability wasn't just convenience, it was strategy. Every time a Sherman started its engine, it extended the Allied reach. It meant a column could move farther, a flank could close faster, a city could fall sooner. The Tiger might win one engagement, but the Sherman won days. And days, in war, are the currency of victory. That currency bought something priceless: tempo. The Allies learned that constant motion, even imperfect motion, suffocated the enemy. The Sherman's design, Modest weight, reliable transmission, ample fuel range enabled that tempo. It didn't matter that its gun wasn't the biggest or its armor the thickest. What mattered was that it was there, on time, every time. That predictability turned chaos into coordination. Even the crew layout reinforced that rhythm. The three-man turret, commander, gunner, loader, allowed each man to specialize, to think faster, to react sooner. German tanks often split attention between fewer crew members, forcing their commanders to double as gunners or radio operators. In the Sherman, the commander was free to command, to scan, to direct, to make decisions. That split-second awareness often meant the difference between spotting a hidden threat and dying to it. But perhaps the most underrated weapon the Sherman carried was its radio. Nearly every Allied tank had one, while many German tanks still relied on flags or runners for coordination. That radio was the heartbeat of the Allied war machine, a direct line to artillery, infantry, and air support. It allowed Shermans to call in P-47 Thunderbolts or to mark targets for artillery within minutes. No other tank of the era was so deeply integrated into the larger network of warfare. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a node in a system of destruction. And that system, flexible, resilient, and relentless, was what crushed the Axis. The Sherman didn't need to be perfect because it belonged to a machine that was. Its victories weren't about armor or caliber, they were about process. When something broke, it got fixed. When a tank burned, another took its place. When the front line stalled, engineers and mechanics adapted until it moved again. That's why even the fiercest critics of the Sherman, when they look deeper, end up admiring it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. It wasn't romantic, but it was reliable. It wasn't feared, it was trusted. There's a reason Allied tankers gave it affectionate nicknames. Old Faithful, Honey, Easy 8. It was the partner that never quit. It didn't boast like the tiger, didn't growl like the panther. It just worked. Every morning, in every climate, it turned over, it rolled out, and it got the job done. Even its so-called inferiority became part of its mystique. The crews knew they were often outgunned, but they also knew how to turn that into motivation. They learned to flank, to move fast, to think tactically. They didn't rely on invulnerability, they relied on skill. And that bred a different kind of soldier, one who respected the enemy, but didn't fear him. It's no accident that some of the most decorated Allied tank commanders, like Lafayette Poole of the U.S. Army, fought and won hundreds of engagements in Shermans. Poole's crew destroyed over 250 enemy vehicles and artillery pieces in less than a year before his tank was finally knocked out. His secret wasn't luck or superior armor. It was mobility, discipline, and teamwork, the very virtues the Sherman was built to reward. By war's end, the statistics told the truth the myths tried to hide. Over 49,000 Shermans built, tens of thousands more modified into recovery tanks, flamethrowers, bulldozers, and amphibious models. Hundreds of thousands of spare parts shipped across oceans. And through it all, one unbroken chain of movement, from factory floor to battlefield, from landing ship to front line, from the hands of a welder in Detroit to the hands of a gunner in Normandy. That's what made the Sherman unbeatable. Not its armor, not its gun, but the unstoppable system of people and purpose that surrounded it. When you strip away the numbers and nostalgia, the truth is simple. The Sherman won because it could afford to learn. Every mistake led to an upgrade. Every battle taught a lesson. Every loss became an adaptation. And when you can evolve faster than your enemy, you don't need to start perfect. You just need to keep going. That was the Sherman's philosophy, whether it was crawling through hedgerows or cresting the dunes at El Alamein. Keep moving, always forward. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Sherman had already written its legacy into history. Across the ruins of Europe, through the sands of North Africa, and deep into the islands of the Pacific, it stood as a symbol of something larger than victory, a testament to the kind of strength that doesn't depend on perfection, but on persistence. Its armor was steel, but its core was human resolve. The crews who served in it knew that truth better than anyone. They had learned to live with its quirks, the tight interior, the groaning suspension, the rattling engine that filled their ears for hours. They had patched its armor with track links, slept on its deck under shell fire, and trusted it with their lives. For them, the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a companion, a home, a constant. When the war ended, many of them would never see one again, but they carried its ghost wherever they went. Some of those ghosts resurfaced years later in unexpected places. On the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli mechanics worked through sleepless nights in desert workshops, cutting, welding, and reboring the barrels of old M4 Shermans. Their updated Super Shermans rolled into battle alongside Centurions and AMX-13s, ancient veterans reborn for a new generation. And when the fighting started, those old tanks, now equipped with French 105mm guns and diesel engines, fought like they'd never aged a day. They climbed hills, dueled Soviet-built T-54s, and once again proved that adaptability, not age, was the true measure of greatness. That image, a tank designed in 1941 destroying one built in the 1950s, says everything about the Sherman's design philosophy. It wasn't just a tool of its time, it was a machine that could evolve. It didn't rely on gimmicks or cutting-edge materials. It relied on sound engineering, accessibility, and human ingenuity. Its blueprint was timeless because it understood that the future of warfare belonged not to the exceptional, but to the sustainable. Even in the Cold War era, the Sherman left fingerprints on everything that followed. The American M48 Patton, the M60, and later the M1 Abrams, all inherited its design DNA. A roomy, crew-centered interior, robust logistics, and an obsession with reliability. The Abrams might be a futuristic behemoth, but philosophically it's the Sherman with muscles and a college degree. It carries the same principle. A tank is only as good as the system that supports it. That system, refined in the 1940s, still shapes modern warfare. Every fuel truck, every recovery vehicle, every modular component owes something to the Sherman's logistical revolution. Even the idea of designing tanks for rapid maintenance, the field fix mindset, came from the lessons of thousands of M4s that had been stripped, repaired, and sent back to battle in days. The Tiger might have been a masterpiece, but the Sherman was a platform, a living concept. And yet, for all its influence, the Sherman's public image took decades to recover. Pop culture loved to mock it, the so-called Ronson that burned first time, every time. It became the butt of jokes, the symbol of Allied mediocrity. But slowly, the tide turned. Veterans spoke out. Historians dug deeper. Footage surfaced of Sherman surviving multiple hits, of crews fighting back, of the tank's sheer versatility in action. The myth of the death trap began to crumble under the weight of facts. Even in video games and internet forums where memes once mocked it as cannon fodder, enthusiasts now champion it for what it truly was. The tank that won through intelligence, not intimidation. They point out its stabilizer, a primitive but pioneering technology decades ahead of its time. They highlight its operational rates, its adaptability, and its sheer presence across every front. Slowly, the narrative shifted from ridicule to respect. The Sherman wasn't the underdog, it was the unsung hero. It's fitting that the tank's final vindication came not in battle, but in understanding. The same internet that once roasted it into infamy also rediscovered it as a symbol of practical genius. The Sherman became the ultimate reminder that war isn't about who looks toughest. It's about who shows up ready to fight, day after day, without fail. If you stand beside a preserved Sherman today, maybe in Bovington or Saumur or Aberdeen, and you place a hand on its armor, you can feel that truth in the cold steel. It's not imposing, it's not majestic, but it's alive. You can almost sense the rhythm of its past, the hum of the engine, the click of the turret traverse, the distant echo of its tracks grinding through mud. It's a quiet monument, not to conquest, but to perseverance. The men who rode in it didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were farmers, mechanics, factory workers, sons who'd been handed a machine and told to keep moving. And they did, through ambushes and blizzards, through fog and fear, through the worst the world could throw at them. They didn't fight for glory, they fought for each other. The Sherman was their armor, but it was also their bond. That bond outlasted the war. In reunions decades later, Sherman crews would still speak of their tanks by name, our girl, our baby, the old man. They'd recall the smell of oil and smoke, the cramped laughter, the moments of terror and triumph. To them, the Sherman wasn't a symbol of loss or luck. It was the vessel that carried them home. And maybe that's why, in the end, the Sherman won more than battles. It won hearts. It proved that greatness isn't about invulnerability, it's about resilience. That innovation isn't about complexity, it's about foresight. And that victory doesn't belong to the biggest or the boldest. It belongs to those who endure. The tank that everyone loves to roast turned out to be the one that actually won. It didn't win through fear or prestige, but through teamwork, reliability, and relentless momentum. It wasn't the sharpest sword, it was the hammer that never broke. When historians ask, what was the best tank of World War II? The answer depends on what you measure. The Tiger may win on firepower, the Panther on precision, the T-34 on simplicity, but the Sherman wins on impact. It was the tank that could be built, shipped, repaired, and fielded anywhere on Earth. It was the machine that tied together continents and campaigns. And when the smoke cleared, it was still there, running, rolling, working. So the next time someone sneers at the Sherman, picture this. Not a duel, but a map. Arrows stretching from Detroit to Normandy, from Cairo to Okinawa, from Haifa to the Golan Heights. Every arrow ends with the same shape. That rounded turret, that sloped hull, that reliable engine humming beneath it all. That's the Sherman's legacy. The tank that looked mid but performed monumental. The tank that outlived empires, outlasted legends, and defined what victory really means. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the one that won the war.